All dogmas lead to blind spots, and chauvinism is a dogma. A dogma is something that maintains its integrity not by referencing data or science, but rather by referencing itself. It is this way because that's the way it is, and that's why it is this way. A little shortcut for parents is because I said so, because that's the way things are done. It's very difficult to solve a dogma within the paradigm of a dogma because you just go round and round and round and round. Whereas to evolve something, to stretch and grow something, one needs to reference something external. If I want to become more intelligent, I have to measure energy consumption externally, and I have to measure sustainable well-being. These are objective metrics of evaluating the intelligence of a structure. Now, one of the faces of chauvinism, if we divide the world into feminine and masculine, is that this splits into inner and outer. And so in a male chauvinistic, or in a culture that is chauvinistically biased towards the masculine in men and in women, the outer, the structure, is overvalued, and the inner is discounted. It's sublimated and undervalued. Now, this makes no scientific sense. No dogma, no chauvinism does. But this bias leads to a number of blind spots. And one of the most important blind spots is the distinction between culture and architecture, between the outer form and the culture that is explored and participated in within the form. Now, I want to talk about a couple of personal experiences of this blind spot. Now, culture is tremendously important. If you want to experience, for example, 1,000% more spontaneous quality time, these are feminine expressions, all one has to do is get into a plane and head to Thailand. In Thailand, it is organically natural, if you are inclined, to spend 1,000% more quality time spontaneously with strangers than you will in the United States. I'm particularly referencing the San Francisco Bay Area. There are parts of the United States that are more conducive to quality time, and there are some parts that may be even more conducive to spontaneous quality time. But to spend spontaneous quality time with someone, you have to elevate the interaction with another human being to the highest priority. If you value getting things done more than spending quality time with people, then the most efficient way to get things done is to create a linear schedule. So you block things out in a sequence, and then you follow the path. You follow the schedule. You create the schedule, and then you follow the schedule. However, this bifurcates heart and body, because rarely does an American wake up in the morning and say, you know what? Of all the things I could possibly be doing in the world, what I'd really like to do is sell 100 boxes of shoe today and make my quota. What I'd really like to do is go down my checklist and do everything on my to-do list, because there's nothing I can imagine that would be more enjoyable than taking out the garbage, doing this, doing that, taking the car in for repair, getting it smog tested, going and paying the insurance bill, disputing this traffic ticket. There's nothing I'd rather do than my long list of scheduled activities. However, if one values quality interactions with another human being, then you wake up and you notice that you'd like to spend some time with Julie this afternoon. And you give Julie a call. And if she's on the wavelength of valuing spontaneous quality time, valuing human interaction as her highest priority, you know, in the history of humanity, there has never been a human being that did not have time to do their highest priority. Every single person has 24 hours in the day. Every single person has a hierarchy of priorities. And every single person is spending their time doing their highest priority in life at that particular moment. When that priority is following a schedule, following a plan, making money, improving the efficiency of whatever it is you're working on, improving the efficiency of doing, then that's exactly what you are doing. If your highest priority is fitting in, is avoiding shame, is conforming to some status quo, then you will look around and see what everyone else is doing and how the cult is ranking value, and you will fit into the groove. The groove defined by a cult, by the dogmas of an often unconscious cult. Now, within chauvinism, one of the things that we see is that when people contribute to a university or a middle school fundraiser, middle school fundraisers may cost a few million, at least in my area. University, if it's an Ivy League university, you might spend $10, $20, $30 million on a building. And these are invariably funded. And one of the reasons they are funded is you can then have your name, or you can have the anonymous legend, because everyone knows where the money came from, associated with a building. However, when it comes time to raise money to increase teacher salaries, or to increase the felt experience of students, there is never any money. Within the chauvinism of a cult that values masculine expression and masculine energy at, say, 70 cents on the dollar, kind of conforms a little bit to the income gap. 70 cents on the dollar. And feminine energy at 30 cents on the dollar, right? Because when you split reality into two, you always have two equal halves. But when you impose a dogma, when you impose a bias, then you have whatever the cult dictates is the split. In this case, it seems to be about 70-30. Now, if you're a human being and you have the masculine and feminine polarity inside of you, if your masculine side is valued at 70 cents on the dollar, and your feminine side is valued at 30. How many human beings are there who feel so filled with value, so filled with validation, so filled with an abundance of value and validation that they really do not care about the way they are ranked by 95% of the population, at work, at home, in bed, and anywhere else? They're so filled with value and validation, self-validation and validation from others, that they do whatever they feel like. If this trait commands 70% respect and value and validation, who cares? If this trait commands 30% respect and validation, who cares? In an incompetent, chauvinistic culture, everyone is starving for love, for validation, and value. Because a chauvinistic culture obscures and devalues the process of seeking and facilitating inner felt experiences because they are feminine. So a cult that will teach you algebra and calculus and the history and names of bridges and the history of dead men 200 years ago and the history of war before it will teach you a single hour of relational competency. In a cult in which that makes sense, it doesn't make sense to directly pursue the feelings of value, love, and belonging, and validation. And so you have a cult mass starvation of the very things that the cult fails to address. Now, if you are starving for validation, for value, for love and belonging in a cult that ranks people higher, 70% versus 30%, for demonstrating masculine traits, and you're starving for value, what are you going to demonstrate? How are you going to perform to get your bread and water for the day? Because whether you're a billionaire or whether you're homeless in the United States, statistically speaking, your feminine side, whether you are male or female, is getting by, is begging, and getting bread and water. It's hanging in there, but it's not in good shape. And so it's a self-perpetuating loop, because the chauvinism that induces scarcity in felt experiential value, validation, love, and belonging, the cult that induces that scarcity promises to give bread and water only to those who play to the very bias that produces the scarcity in the first place, namely lead with the masculine pole. And so if you've survived and gotten this far and often made all that money or risen in business precisely so that you could gain rank in a chauvinistic cult that does not have a measuring system for the kindest man or woman, for the most competent parent, for the best teacher, for the one who induces the most joy and well-being in the community, where everything feminine about you doesn't even get measured, let alone be put on a building. You see, because in a healthy cult that was based on science, well, what is the most obvious science? Well, parenting, the art of parenting, is the single most profound science for the next 100 years of the species that can be devised. The art of parenting. The way that the next generation is prepared mentally, emotionally, physically to create the future, to create and sustain the cult. So naturally, one can go cradle to grave in this cult without a single formal hour of competent parental training. Oh, you'll learn how to tell secrets and tell lies and rile up your spouse in order to feel important. You'll learn how to blow up and walk out of the room. You will learn all kinds of memes about navigating the parental terrain by emotionally illiterate, relationally illiterate, psychologically illiterate people who are largely copying or rebelling against their own parentally illiterate parents. Copying is not the same as competent education. And copying people who have absolutely horrendous statistics is a sign of profound desperation and incompetence. But who else is there to copy in a cult that refuses to teach parenting in kindergarten, refuses to teach it in middle school, refuses to teach it in high school, refuses to teach it in college, refuses to teach it at work, refuses to teach it in dating dynamics, and decides to have children without a single hour of competent parental training? How dumb do you have to be as a cult? Because this is not personal. How dumb do you have to be as a cult before the vast majority of people in that cult look out at this staggering statistic of incompetence and abuse generation after generation after generation and say, makes sense to me. Let me do exactly what my parents did and have kids without a single formal hour of competent parental training. Because it's normal in a dysfunctional cult. Well, that's the cult that we're in. But one of the reasons why you're likely to have more training in the history of dead men, it's called the history of US presidents, you're likely to have more training in the history of other dead men, it's called the history of wars, and you're likely to have more training in algebra. It's called getting an education, than you are in relational literacy, psychological literacy, traumatic literacy, emotional literacy. There are lots of different synonyms to some extent in their overlap. But basically anything feminine is not only taboo to add to any curriculum, it's shameful to mention in a chauvinistic cult. And so in this context, if one is to believe the cult, one is to be prepared to manufacture things which are more important than how you feel, how many kids love going to school in the United States? And what is the response when the protest emerges? It's very simple. You have to go to school. It doesn't matter how you feel. You've got to do this because you've got to get a job. And the only way you can get a job, another thing you probably don't want to do, 70% of Americans hate their job. And you've got to have a job because that's what life is all about. So, if you've been told this by people who say they love you your entire life, and nobody has had the decency to, hello, could we interrupt the mantra here? Could we wake up from the dream here and say, who the fuck cares about the history of dead people when we do not even know how to communicate with living people in effective protocols that generate high levels of well-being? Who the fuck cares about algebra? Hey, teacher, when's the last time you used algebra in the last year? Well, my math teacher, when I asked them this question, said they learned it, they used it because that's what gave them a job teaching me. I said, so if you didn't have a job teaching me stuff that you've never used a day in your life, other than to make money repeating what was given to you, where else did you use it? Nowhere. So the entire basis of teaching algebra is, I suppose, in case I want to be a math teacher. Now, there are a minority of people who love mathematics and do actually use it in their work for other than indoctrinating the next generation. But where are they? My sister's not using algebra. My parents aren't using algebra. I'm not using algebra. My employees are not using algebra. But every single one of them would benefit greatly from the art of communication. Something that, for some strange and mysterious reason, doesn't get a single hour of competent training at home, at school, at work, or in couple dynamics. I've yet to meet the woman out of thousands who said, hey, Dane, let's learn how to talk like this, because if we learn to talk like this, we'll have a better relationship. It doesn't come up in a chauvinistic cult. It would be intelligent if it came up. It just doesn't. Now, when you don't measure felt experience, how many of you have ever received a survey talking about how you feel eating this diet, talking this way, watching this media, relative to a host of other options? How do you feel as a cult member of America versus a cult member of Denmark or Thailand? How many of you would rank your cult higher or lower objectively in communication skills based relative to the cults that you've traveled to or visited? How is this data aggregated? This would be an intelligent science, the science of felt well-being, the science of competence in different areas. No one's ever given me a comprehensive survey to fill out. And so the fact that they are unaware of my opinion about things that not a single person in this cult has ever asked me about is guaranteed. The question is, if nobody's asking and nobody's volunteering, all of the most important things in a cult, how can you steer the cult with such willful blindness? Because the reason mostly men will generate lots of money and then donate it to their alma mater for a university gymnasium or whatever it is with the family emblem is because that's measured. Because in our cult, in a chauvinistic cult, bricks and mortar is viewed as the pinnacle of accomplishment. I don't want to waste time with feminine things like how the kids feel and teachers and this. Nobody cares about that because nobody measures it. What I want is for all time my name on a building. I'll work my ass off doing something I often dislike to make the $30 million so that I can be important in a cult that measures bricks and mortar and doesn't have the intelligence to measure sustainable well-being. Well, when we understand this underlying bias, and it's not a science-based bias, it's a cult-based bias. It's a dogmatic bias. When we understand this bias, then, of course, it makes perfect sense that everyone that we might want to spend a spontaneous afternoon with in the cult of America is busy staying busy in order to get things done that really matter through the chauvinistic lens of exterior accomplishment. You can't just have someone pause and enjoy the luxury of eye gazing, or get 37-second hugs and watch oxytocin go through the roof, because that's not productive. And we all know we have to produce something out there in order to matter, because we've all learned by watching 10,000 people in 10,000 ways that how we feel in here has zero value. That's why your government will never send you a survey asking you how you feel. How do you feel as an American? What's your enthusiasm level 1 to 10? How effectively have you processed grief as an American? 1 to 10, how depressed are you? 1 to 10, what can we as your government do to help you feel loved and belonging? You see, this is all wrong from the eyes of a chauvinist. How people feel? What's gotten into you? Aren't you part of the gang of men and women who agree to pretend that feelings don't matter? That, fine, have some feelings here and there, but, we'll look the other way as you burst into tears of joy or grief or whatever, because it's an embarrassment to acknowledge the fact that we're actually human and that every single action in human history is linked to how we feel. How embarrassing. So, don't ask, don't tell is the cult's meme around feelings. Now, one of the incredibly profound repercussions of this systematic wave of chauvinism, the self-referential loop of endless superiority of the masculine and the endless shaming of the feminine, which is heightened in men. One of the reasons that in my generation, as a 46-year-old American male, one of the reasons that homosexuality is so taboo is because it's feminine. It's acknowledging that two men can have feelings of tenderness for each other. And that's a horrific thought to any chauvinist It's to admit inferiority. It's guilt by association with the feminine, tenderness, emotions, responsiveness, desire, need. It's heretical to the chauvinistic doctrine to acknowledge that men feel deeply and value the tenderness with other men and women. So, homosexual men in America have been subjected to more fear and more shame than almost any other group of people. Because we all know that women who can't really help being born women are inferior, but they can't help it. They can't help being associated with femininity, but as a man, you could have been great. You had it all going your way because masculine energy is more valuable than feminine energy, and you were fortunate enough to be born in a male body, which means you had to choose to honor your femininity. And that's just wrong. You can be beaten to death. You can be shot. You can be attacked socially, politically, financially for such a taboo. And in my generation, I grew up watching. The greatest horror, I would say, that I've ever seen in media of any man was to be associated with being gay. Well, that's a natural fallout of systematic, dogmatic chauvinism. Because it's not ultimately about male and female. It's about feminine energy and spontaneous quality time that doesn't require the making or spending of money is more feminine than structured, organized time for the purpose of producing something useful to make money. It doesn't matter if you are making rubber ducks. That's how crazy this is. If you figured out how to make 10% more rubber ducks per hour and thus increase the sales of the company, the most noble pinnacle in a capitalist hierarchy, if you figured out how to make 10% more rubber ducks, you're a hero. But if you made your 6-year-old feel valuable playing Little League and left the team of rubber duck makers, you are a traitor of the cult of chauvinism, of the cult of external productivity. And this is the dogma that is punched, hammered, directly and indirectly, because we see what the cult does to the people who don't conform. You see, the people who don't conform to the cult do not make as much money. The people who don't make as much money are marginalized. The people who are marginalized are more stressed, more alienated, more anxious, and more sick. The people that don't conform are arrested. Blacks? Is their crime that they are black, or is their crime that they are a minority? If blacks were the majority, wouldn't whites be the persecuted? in the same sociopathic framework that fears difference, that rewards conformity? Isn't the greatest crime of being black that they are different, that they introduce the awareness of difference and thus the fear of the unknown? Isn't that the crime of every minority that has been persecuted with tremendous malice and cruelty throughout history? That they were different. They had a different pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being than the majority. If everyone was homosexual, then it would not introduce one to the fear of the unknown, the fear of re-traumatization, of being out of control. To fit in and be gay. In fact, if you are not gay enough, if you are not feminist enough, if you are not productive enough in your cult, you will be thrown out. There is as much viciousness directed at feminists who are not good enough feminists, that are not towing the party line, as there is towards African Americans because they're not white, as there is towards homosexuals because they're homosexuals, or within the homosexual clique because they're not being proud and outward enough about their homosexuality. The cult sets the standard. This is the standard. It looks like this. And if you have a pattern that looks like that, you are deviating from what? The cult pattern, the norm. And what does that make you? It makes you a deviant, a minority. That's all anyone needs to hear to understand that you're going to be in for a hard time. That's all anyone needs to hear to understand that your life in this cult is going to be a living hell. Deviant actually has a negative connotation in the cult. Now, if we look at the bell curve of intelligence, we understand that the majority is always average. And there are two minorities. You have the bleeding edge of genius, that's always a minority. And then you have the Luddites, the people that haven't figured out that reading is a good idea, that driving a car could be more efficient. You have the Luddites that haven't caught up with the cult. And then you have the geniuses, and they are each equal minorities, 1 or 2%. 1 or 2%, and in the middle you have average. You have the majority, the square box of, look, all you have to do is look around at what everyone else is doing. So if you want to find intelligence, you have to find people deviating from this box. Now, once you deviate, you take a bet in your deviation. Now, most people, when they're deviating from the cult as a conscious choice, are doing so because they've analyzed the dysfunction in the cult, the inefficiency, and they're believing that they can iterate, they can do a better job than average if they deviate from the status quo. Now, they may be wrong. They may deviate from the status quo and, in fact, be going slowly insane, dissociative. And if you are dumb, unfortunately, you lack the intelligence to know whether you're heading in a dumb direction or an intelligent direction. So you happily deviate from the cult, thinking you're superior in some way. And you end up in the 1 or 2% that are so dumb they don't understand that they're dumb, and so they're proud of it. But you see, life has always bet on diversity. Nature loves diversity. Nature loves deviation. It's the protocol of life. Find a winning thing, put most of your eggs in that, but just in case there's the Irish potato famine, let's plant some Brussels sprouts. Doesn't have to be the main crop, but let's have some cabbage, some Brussels sprouts, some this, because who can predict the future for sure? Because wouldn't you know, after a major earthquake, it was, the Quakers with their wagons that knew how to survive when there was a gasoline shortage, right? You see, when you create diversity, you create multiple winning strategies simultaneously. So we may look at people still driving around in carriages and horses and say, it doesn't seem very efficient, doesn't fit into the cult, you haven't kept up with the time. But there's often a circular nature to these things. What was out of fashion, an old hat, becomes retro and trendy again 20 years later. The Native Americans were not viewed with much interest or respect 400 or 500 years ago, but their ranks are going up. Their ranking in the American cult is climbing as we realize some basic things, including the fact that a Native American died with less than a kilogram of waste at the end of a long and interesting life. But an American dies with 100 metric tons of energy in a form that it doesn't know what to do with. And so we call it garbage. Less than a kilogram, 100 tons. Maybe we could learn something from the people we slaughtered. Or then again, maybe not. But in the cyclical nature of reality, what's going down often comes up. What's going up often comes down. And that's a good thing, because how would the wheel of life continue if we moved closer and closer every year to extremism? The severing of the universe into two equal parts. You cannot cut anything in half and not have two equal parts. That's obvious to science, but it's not obvious to chauvinists. If you ask a chauvinist if men are more important than women, well, of course, it goes without saying. And then you ask them to produce another man without involving a woman. Well, of course, they need women to produce men. But that's not a sane equation. That's a dogma. To say that a man needs a woman that is less inferior, that is more inferior than the man that needs her, is an equation that doesn't compute, except in the blindness of dogma. And it's into that blindness that the sustained, willful ignorance about cultural design is universal in Western cults. How many of you have spent a single hour of your life designing a culture, designing the way people feel, designing the things that produce those feelings, designing the rituals that allow certain bandwidths of feelings to express themselves, designing rituals that create cohesive, sustainable relationships, that create love and belonging, that create value? How many of you have received a single formal hour of training in cultural design at home, at school, college, work, with your partners, with your new chosen group of friends, with all your hobbies and activities? When have you ever been sat down and said, hey, let's design a cult, with the goal of being 10 times more intelligent than the cult that you're in? Because an American doesn't come cheap. To raise an American costs around $400,000, about 18,000 hours. By the time of death, 100 tons of energy that we don't know what to do with, so we call it waste. There's 90,000 gallons of gasoline consumed to facilitate the American lifestyle. It's not a cheap purchase. That's a lot of energy available as a resource to produce felt experiential well-being. So how happy is the average American relative to the 10,000 cults in human history, given that its energy consumption is 1,000 times more per capita than most of the cults in human history? Are they 1,000 times happier? Or are they more tired, more depressed, more irritable, more addictive? Are Americans getting their money's worth in felt experiential well-being? Well, the answer is a resounding no. Now, is it the fault of the money? Is it the fault of the trees? Is it the fault of the gasoline? Like if the gasoline was just tweaked so that an American consumed 90,000 gallons of slightly different gasoline, superior gasoline, that their life would magically improve? Is it the fault of what they call garbage? 100 tons, if an American produced 100 tons of yardage instead of garbage, would somehow their well-being increase? Is it the fault of Americans? Are they somehow genetically inferior than 99% of the cults in human history? Because with so much more energy available, they couldn't create a commensurate level of so much more sustainable well-being available. Where is the fault? And I'd suggest that there's nothing wrong with Americans at birth, nothing wrong with American bodies, there's nothing wrong with the American landscape. If Americans were raised as Americans in Tuscany rather than in America, the byproducts in felt experiential well-being would be very similar. There's nothing wrong with America, the land. There's nothing wrong with energy. There's nothing wrong with physics. So where does the fault lie? And one possibility is that it lies with the cult, with the culture, with the cultural identity, with the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is the American identity. That if that were changed, in a substantial way that Americans, without changing any of their genetics, without moving to another country, without radically changing their diet, that Americans could consume less energy and be sustainably happier than the Americans produced by the conformity of this cult. Now, that is the most rational hypothesis that I have come across. That if exactly the same Americans changed their pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, their identity, that in the exact same landscape, with the exact same access to resources, with the same genetics and body weights and size, that Americans could consume less energy and be happier, employing a different cult design, deviating that horror of horrors, deviating from the norm, that Americans could become substantially more intelligent than they are, blindly following the cult they were handed at birth. That's my supposition. And America's cult memes have traveled widely. In a materialist paradigm, a paradigm that has been growing over the last 200 years. 200 years ago, there were far fewer human beings who believed that outer materialist forms were the single most important thing in their lives. You just need to give people cars and refrigerators and savings accounts, and they too can copy the American cult and become happy and live meaningful lives, going and doing jobs to buy food for that refrigerator and eat the food out of the refrigerator, and then they can live meaningful, happy lives. Well, one of the areas that this hit me was my own existential depression, grief, trauma that hit me around age 36, age 37. And what hit me was this. I was already eating the nicest food that I could buy anywhere in the world. My house was nicer than any house I could have imagined as a teenager. My job was considered a great success as a business owner, making up to $1,000 an hour. I was debt-free. My kitchen had more than 50 varieties of fine organic teas. My home was filled with art. It's not hard to generate sex in this culture, and so certainly sex was available. I had 2 or 3 therapists I could visit every single week to rehash the same old stuff. I could travel around the world. I had a growing retirement account, no debt. So why did I feel like dying? Why did I feel so hopeless, so helpless? Why did I feel despair, lonely, fear of an unbearable amount of pain that I didn't know how to relate to? It certainly wasn't anything that $140,000 of therapy had addressed. So why did I feel all of this? And the most horrific aspect of feeling this pain at this stage in life was the following glaring observation. Those who are interested in alternatives, by the way, crystals, organic food, being a vegetarian, whatever it is, using recycled paper, whatever the list and check mark is of all the things that are going to change your life. Within a chauvinistic culture, these are all usually things that cost money and involve buying different things. You buy these things instead of these things. You do these things instead of these things. But within that framework, I was already doing more therapy than anyone that I knew. I already had more crystals than anyone that I knew. I'd already spent more time with channeled entities than anyone that I knew. I'd traveled the world to spiritual centers, etc., more than 99% of the population. I'd been vegetarian since birth and eaten the finest organic foods. I already was a successful entrepreneur. I already had money invested. I was already debt-free. I already had the ability to travel around the world. And this is precisely what was so depressing. Because when I was 10 and 12 and 14 and 20, and some of the many preachers in the New Age and alternatives would wander around, oh, the joys of a vegan diet, the joys of raw food, the joys of an all-cashew diet, the joys of macrobiotics, the joys. If only you will get debt-free, if only you will tend to your retirement, if only you will achieve thousands of goals, says the cult. Doesn't matter if it's the normal cult or the alternative. If only you will do these things, tend this workshop, hire this, read my book, then you will be happy. Now, a 12-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old believes these things because they haven't done them. If you've done them and you're not happy, you cannot believe them. But if you say, well, I do feel miserable, and yes, I have not read their book, and that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying that if I read their book, then I will stop feeling miserable. Well, this works for the first book and the second book and the third book. But after reading 500 books, 700 books, at some point, the idea that this one time the next book is going to transcend stops seeming so realistic. Because you've been lied to 700 times. By 700 prophets, all promising this diet, that diet, this, it stops being so believable. And it stops being intelligent to rush off and buy the 701 book, right? It stops being intelligent to go off to the 43rd therapist instead of the second therapist and the third therapist and the fourth therapist and the fifth therapist. It stops being so wonderful to turn $1 into $2 and $2 into $4 and $4 into $8 and $8 into $16. At some point in that journey, you realize that I could turn this dollar into $10 trillion, and it doesn't seem to be doing what the cult promised that worshiping money would do. Now, this is a horrifying moment. It's a horrifying moment because I've already done more of the intelligent things, quote unquote, that I've been told to do my entire life. I've already done more than 95% of the population will ever do. And I feel worse than I did 20 years ago. That is a horrifying realization. And it is a realization that I had going down in suicidal levels of pain in my late 30s. I do not believe that traveling here, or eating this, or reading this, or making more money, doing this or this or this, is going to answer this loneliness, this fear of an extraordinary amount of pain that does not seem to go up or down, whether I have the macrobiotic diet or the raw food diet, whether I go jogging or relax in my hot tub or fill my house with crystals or stay in a hotel. It doesn't seem to go down. And there's something else that's troubling. Because if you do succeed and don't buy into too much of the more is always better, because that's kind of the American mantra, right? More is better, keep busy, then keep busier, right? This is the way to supposedly outrun one's feelings, one's feminine side. Now, naturally, the neglected, shamed, devalued, untrained feminine inside each human being is not very happy about being shamed, about being neglected, about being untrained, of being devalued, because some fucked up Frenchman named Mr. Chauvin decided one day to be all obsessed, in this case with France, independent of the data. This is where the blind spot of chauvinism emerges. It's not very happy, the inner feminine in men and in women, about being devalued since birth purely for existing in a way that does not correlate to science. Because one of the morals of the golden goose, the lovely story, is that the golden goose is more valuable than a single golden egg. Now, maybe you missed that point. And maybe it isn't showing up on iPad learning or iPad parenting. But it's a very important principle that the source of value is more valuable than any one unit of the value produced. Now, if the source of value is a woman who produces men, the most valuable, that's all, and women capable of producing more men, if the golden goose is more valuable than the golden egg, then chauvinism makes no sense. Because women produce every single one of the men that men and women pretend in a chauvinistic cult are more valuable. Meaning, the chauvinists of our cult, and every American is a chauvinist unless they deprogram the bullshit given to them. The chauvinists will tell you that a man and that masculine energy is more valuable than a woman and feminine energy. This chauvinism has gotten a little bit more sophisticated because more and more people are acknowledging that women are equal to men. Doesn't hurt that the science suggests that they are equal in a cult that claims to be scientific, but more and more people are grudgingly acknowledging that women are as valuable as men. But both men and women are holding firm on the idea that masculine traits, extroversion instead of introversion, speaking instead of listening, giving instead of receiving, creating rather than being, that masculine traits in men and women are more valuable than feminine traits. It makes no more sense than the theory that men were more valuable than women. But who said that cults make sense? Who said that you and I have a clue how to deal with reality? Who says that? We do. Every cult tells its members that, without even questioning it, they are the best and most advanced cult that it has ever been and will ever be. And every cult is a liar. That's why 95% of all cults are dead. They don't exist anymore. All the lies they told their children about this is the way things should be done so that you can go extinct as a cult. Those kids believed those lies because giants called parents, regardless of their competency, told the lies. So cult design is messed up. And cults are very fragile. Why are 95% of all cults extinct? Because they're insane. Because they're unscientific. Because when people finally have to choose between living and thriving and fitting into a defunct, failing cult, they choose finally to let go of the cult, but not before they've chosen every other option imaginable to ennoble the cult that they were born into, that protects them from the vastness of the unknown. So I was not doing well because wherever I looked, I'd done that and been there, and it wasn't working. Nobody had suggested that I examine my cult because I was listening to members of the cult who depended on their cult, who recreated their cult fractally in their own egoic identity, in their own pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being every day. So that was the missing piece. And I finally settled on psychedelics as one area. I'd never been drunk. I'd never been high. Wasn't interested in drugs. Wasn't interested in alcohol. But I looked at it like this. Number one, it is absolutely insane to think that having more money than I already have, when I have more money than 99% of every cult in human history per capita, I already have more than 99% of money. I've got more of a retirement fund than 99% of the people in human history, most of which got on just fine without a retirement fund. I've achieved more goals, yearly, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily goals, than most people in human history. I've visited more therapists than 99% of people in human history. I've read more books than 99% of people in human history. I've been a vegetarian since birth. If that's not good enough, if you have to be a vegetarian before you were born, that's not going to happen. The all-organic food diet, the get more sex approach, the run your own company, take control of your life. If those were going to work for me, my life would already feel fantastic, rather than chronic fatigue, depression, naturally exhaustion, loneliness, anxiety, and a tremendous fear of being hurt emotionally, a tremendous experience and fear of loneliness. That's how I felt living this perfect life. And it felt so bad, meaning it felt 3-to-1, 300% pain, 100% or 75% pain, 25% well-being. 75% of my life was pain and the fear of pain, was desperation, was loneliness. 75%. And 25% was enjoying the perfect life. That's not sustainable. Nobody intelligent wants to perpetuate a 3-to-1 ratio with pain in the majority, with fear in the majority. It's absolutely miserable. And I was looking at my life and trying to think, if I saw 6 therapists a week instead of 3, if I imported organic food from Yugoslavia rather than California, if I traveled around the world twice as fast, if I made twice as much money, if I read 1,200 books rather than 700 books, would I feel less tired? Would I feel less depressed? Would I feel less lonely? Would I be hurting less if I achieved another 3,000 goals? And I had to conclude that I don't see a correlation between so many of these dogmas, so many of these prescriptions in my well-being. I don't see a correlation to the latest person coming around saying, do this, it'll change your life. And my life feeling substantially better. I don't see a correlation to making more money and more money and more money and being happier. And the logical thing to do is to leave this planet. As a game I don't enjoy playing, because if I'm playing with a competitive chess player, I don't enjoy the game. I don't enjoy that I've got to win at all costs in a win-lose dynamic. And so I get up and I leave the game because I enjoy being in my hot tub more. I enjoy writing another book more than I enjoy the stress of competitive chess. Now, if it's let's see what happens and play along, then chess is wonderful. But my point is, when I'm in a relationship with a woman who feels so insecure that her main goal is to make me feel terrible about myself so that I won't leave her, I get up and leave. I mean, I may start off with some basic communication. Are you aware that you undermine everything that I succeed at? Are you aware that you don't celebrate when I have an accomplishment? Are you aware that you harp on every one of my faults? And are you aware that you seem very anxious and jealous of other women? And are you aware that the very thing that at some level you're most afraid of, which is driving me away, is exactly what you're doing with shaming and criticizing my faults and refusing to honor my accomplishments? You're not aware that you're doing that. Well, here's the pattern. Okay, here's the pattern. Are you aware of this and this and this? Do you notice how I did this and you didn't say anything? But I did this, and this was, the world was going to come to an end. Now, which do you think is more impactful objectively? I achieved this major goal, and I left a dish in the sink without washing it, heaven forbid, within 20 minutes, which is the arbitrary definition that you've defined as too late to leave in the sink. Which do you think has more impact? Is it intelligent for you to ignore this and punish this? Oh, it is. I see. Okay, well, thank you very much. I've made my best effort not to abandon you, since that is your biggest fear. Goodbye. You can do this to another man. Now, I leave games that are lose-lose games and that are win-lose games. I like playing win-win games. You need to find people who are into the mindset, number one. But it brings up the question, if I walk away from chess because it's a win-lose game and it's not very much fun, if I walk away from this relationship because it's a lose-lose game and it's not very much fun, and the player will not change the rules to one that could be win-win and a lot of fun, it begs the question, why am I playing this game that involves getting up again, feeling tired again, feeling anxious again, and being told again to do the very things that leave me feeling this way day after day? And nobody wants to hear it. My therapist doesn't want to hear that therapy isn't working. This other therapist doesn't want to hear that therapist isn't working. And surprise, surprise, this other therapist doesn't want to hear that therapist isn't working. But nor do they want to do the things that would make therapy actually work. They don't want to hear that it isn't working, and they don't want to do the things to make it work. I can point out, we've gone around here multiple times, maybe there's another route, but I don't know what it is, because amongst the many advices to go see a therapist, nobody said, why don't you go study the dysfunction in the therapeutic community? That might have led somewhere. And because in a cult filled with memes of largely reinforcing the status quo, there are very few memes that involve questioning the status quo. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy making these videos. You're not crazy. There's nothing wrong with you. You've been given a recipe in a cult that is not the worst recipe, certainly, that any cult has ever given its members. But it is statistically incompetent. And your cult is never going to tell you that, because it's a shame-based cult in which anyone who admits a mistake deserves to be punished. That's the basis of a shame-based cult. If you make a mistake, then you have to be punished for your mistake. And so naturally, no authority figure will admit any mistakes. Your president incited a riot. No, they didn't do anything wrong. Your other president raped a woman. Oh, no, they didn't do anything wrong, right? Your parents, the list of transgressions is too long to count. But no authority figure in a shame-based cult will ever admit they did anything wrong, because in a shame-based cult, everyone's duty is to punish them. And nobody will admit that that's wrong, that doesn't actually work as well as educate them and do something different. And so we add punishment to the many dysfunctions of an unconscious, shame-based cult. Now, I finally settled on psychedelics. And I basically reasoned it this way. I'm planning on killing myself because I don't like the game. I don't know how to change the variables of the game because I've already done all the things that people say to do to change the variables. Yes, I've listened to my inner child. Yes, I've done reiterative healings, more than 500. Oh, you have to do 1,000 relivings of your inner child? 10,000? Yes, and I've done it to the adolescent as well. Yes, I've written my principles and my values. Yes, I have my vision statement. Yes, I've done this. Yes, I've done this. Yes, I've invited more than 1,000 women to have a conscious conversation about this and about this and this. And surprisingly, all these women complaining that men don't talk, they can't stand it when a man actually talks about these things. Gee, I used to complain about men not being able to talk, but then I met you and I realized what those men feel like because you're always talking. Oh my goodness, right? So, yes, I've done this, and yes, I've done this, and yes. I've made peanut butter out of cashews that were just the right level of raw, and I did this, and I did that, and I went to the festival, and I did the affirmations, and I feel like shit. And I know you don't want to hear about that because it might suggest that you don't know everything. And it is chauvinistic to value knowing something more than not knowing it. And so if you admit that you don't know what you're talking about, you will lose rank in the chauvinistic cult that you believe in. And so I was planning on checking out because I didn't like the game. But the question then becomes, have I tried everything? Because it would be a pity, wouldn't it, to get to be 40 years old and then give up on life because for 40 years, life was more painful and frightening by a considerable margin than it was enjoyable, uplifting, beautiful. That life was more miserable than it was beautiful for 40 years of the 40 years on the planet, and appeared likely to continue at the same ratio, meaning that every single year for the rest of my life, I would experience 2/3 to 3/4 chronic suffering and 1/4 to 1/3 of sustainable well-being, with obviously there being various vacillations because, falling in love might be just 1/3, right? Only 2/3 well-being, whereas breaking up might be 3/4 of misery, right? So there's a variance, but the high points are far fewer than the low points. And I don't want to work this hard to feel this bad for the rest of my life, I don't feel it's kind to me to stick around in a game that's this painful, in which no one wants to acknowledge the pain that I'm in or that their advice isn't working. They'd rather I die than tell them how full of shit this and this and this and this actually turned out to be. You know, and some of this is the very psychological illiteracy that I'm talking about. You know, in a psychologically illiterate culture, you are naturally psychologically illiterate. And there's a phenomena in healings and therapies that might be akin to the phenomena in subcontracting to build a house. Because if you build a house in the United States, there's a framer, there's an insulator, there is an electrician, there is a plumber, there is a floor contractor, there is a roofing contractor, there is a window contractor. You get the idea. There's lots of different contracting. And in the cleaning phenomena of maintaining a house, there is a window cleaner and a house cleaner and a painter, right? There's all the different specialties. Now, what if your windows were absolutely covered in soot? And someone recommended that you hire a gutter cleaner to check your gutters, and the gutter cleaner came out and said, no, your gutters are fine. There's nothing wrong with your gutters. You say, but it feels terrible. Let's look at this thing. Yeah, well, there's nothing wrong with your gutters. And see, some of the trouble in these therapies is, do you want healing? Hire a healer. Do you want therapy? Hire a therapist. But what if your therapist is a gutter cleaner and you've got soot all over your windows? Or what if your therapist is a window cleaner and you just had the windows cleaned 2 weeks ago, but they aren't a gutter cleaner and your gutters are clogged? Every time it rains, it overfills the gutter and pours down on your nice suit. You say, this doesn't seem right. I thought this was what gutters were for. So you hire the window cleaner again. We're in that level of ignorance around healing because we haven't correlated the healer with the modality, with what's actually needed. We've done it somewhat in conventional wisdom, where you have ear, nose, and throat specialists, and you have elbow specialists, elbow and hand specialists, and you have all these different specialists. So usually if you have an elbow issue you'd go to an elbow surgeon, right? And they wouldn't amputate your leg, they would tend to your elbow, right? But in feminine terrains that have not been mapped out because they're feminine, that's the whole basis of chauvinism. There's no logic behind it. It's feminine, so we know nothing about it because we don't value it enough to know anything about it. And so, a healer, go see a healer. What type of healer? Well, a healer, a good healer. Go see a good healer, and all your problems will be solved, says the New Age guru. Or I will heal you, right? I will heal you. But we don't break it down. Are you a window cleaning healer, a gutter cleaning healer? Are you a traumatic specialist? Are you a this? Are you a that? And how do you know you'll do it? How do you know I don't have clogged up windows? How do you know I don't have a stopped up toilet? How do you know you're going to heal me? What if you clean my windows and my toilet is still blocked? Well, this is a little bit too sophisticated for healers in a chauvinistic cult, because this would actually involve mapping the psyche, something that the Greeks thought was a good idea, but we have regressed. We have regressed into more ignorance than 3,000-year-old ancestors. I mean, how far do you have to go back before people thought it was a good idea to map out the psyche? most of human history contains a tremendous amount of mythology, which is the map of the psyche and of the emotions. But we'll settle for Bambi and cartoons that mask our feelings. So, at any rate, I highlighted the fact that I had not tried psychedelics. In fact, I had never been drunk. And I thought, wouldn't it be a pity to commit suicide and then review my life? This is one of the theories in alternative and Christian, for that matter. And in fact, most people in human history believe that something lives on after the body dies. You go back to the Greeks, you go back to the Romans, you go back to the Celts, you go back to 99% of the cults in human history. You go back to the Christians, go back to this version of Christianity, the Buddhists. They all believe the same thing, that there is something that survives the death of the physical body. And many of them believe in a lifetime review, that you kind of look at, you did a good job here, didn't do such a good job there, that you review your life and reflect on it in some way. Now, some in a shame-based cult believe that a big man reviews your life and then punishes you for everything you did badly. In less chauvinistic mythologies and religions, it's you review your life and feel sad where you could have done better because it would have been nice to have done better. But there's a life review. And I thought, assuming there is a life review, which 99% of the people in human history seem to believe will occur, wouldn't it be a pity if I reviewed my life? Yes, 3/4 pain, 2/3 pain, 3/4 pain, 2/3 pain, But then I discovered that there was this simple thing I could have done that nobody had told me about that would have transformed my life. And the spiritualists didn't like drugs, right? And the US government didn't like drugs. So the spiritualists and the US government were all, and my parents didn't like drugs, right? So everyone around me had always been anti-drugs. And it took considering suicide in a very serious and public way. I wrote to my community about my plan to die. It took to consider, if psychedelics ruin your brain, as the US government will gladly tell you and fund research to prove, it doesn't really matter if you're dead, does it, right? If being drunk is a bad idea, well, that doesn't matter if you're dead either. So it kind of opens things up a little bit as a reasonable choice, right? Die or get drunk. Die or eat a mushroom, right? It puts things into perspective, is a good way of saying it. So I decided that I would study and see if there was anything to this drug thing, right? So I read Foods for the Gods by Terence McKenna, and I read Acid Test by Rick Doblin. And they had nothing but positive things to say about drugs. Mushrooms were wonderful. MDMA was wonderful. Benefits were happening to people in miserable states that, PTSD and stuff. So I thought, well, all this wonderful stuff happening. Who am I to keep it all at bay, right? Wonderful stuff is a mushroom away. Let's eat some mushrooms. But I looked at the literature and it seemed to suggest that having a sitter was a great idea. Unfortunately, given that in its infinite wisdom, the US government has decided to make it illegal to own or eat natural mushrooms that contain psychoactive compounds, i.e. psilocybin, it was difficult. I couldn't just go online and say, who's got good Yelp reviews for helping people have great experiences eating mushrooms? Because if someone was good and had great Yelp reviews, then the US government, in its infinite wisdom, would go over and arrest them and spend $100,000 a year of public money to lock them up so that they couldn't help other people have great mushroom sessions. And so this then puts one in the terrain of gossip. It puts one in the underground, in the illegal terrain of, will you help me? Are you good? Et cetera, et cetera. And you can't look at reviews and you can't get feedback because everyone's hiding from the sociopathic love of their government, which is, if you want to eat some mushrooms, we will put you in jail. If you want to help someone eat some mushrooms, we will put you in jail. And we won't tell you why, and we won't talk about it, et cetera, et cetera. It's just bad, but putting you in jail is not bad. Spending $100,000 of public money, not bad. Now, we're not going to talk about how crazy that is because then we might have to change, and we don't want to. We're your friendly government. But nevertheless, I looked at this, and it seemed like, well, eat some mushrooms and risk being thrown in jail by my friendly government, or die. And what if once I died, I realized that eating a few mushrooms would have made the difference, right? That would have been so foolish, right? You get there and you look back, your life review, and it's like, well, if you had just eaten a few mushrooms, then you might have made it over the hump and gotten to a basis where 60% of your life was wonderful rather than 60% was miserable. So it just seemed irrational not to give mushrooms and MDMA a fair shot. So I found Peter Sandhill, who had professed his interest in all of this towards me. He'd actually shown a romantic interest in me as his therapist 10 years earlier. And he'd suggested, my therapist had suggested, after expressing his lust for me in our first session, he had suggested eating MDMA together and then seeing what happened, right? And of course, charging me his normal fees for these advices. I thought, I remembered this, right? Because again, there's a deficit of suppliers of data, right? So it's like, Peter, I've decided to do this. Will you be my sitter, right? I don't want you to take it, but will you do this for me? And he was only too delighted. However, in Rick Doblin's book on acid tests, nobody mentioned that things could go horribly wrong. So again, in the urgency of assuaging suicide, it seemed like time was of the essence. I thought I did my research reading a couple of books. No one talked about falling in love with their therapist in any of these sessions. And this is, of course, the confirmation and information bias, because you have over here the US government saying, drugs are the most horrible things. They'll ruin your whole life. That's why we have to put you in jail to rescue you. And then over here, you have, people like Rick and stuff saying, the whole world would just be wonderful if everyone took drugs. And the US government gets tax dollars and gets paid to spout and pursue its war on human beings, called the war on drugs. And, people who are, involved with psychedelics often get paid to talk about psychedelics, and they wouldn't get paid if, psychedelics were viewed as horrible things. So you have these two things, and unfortunately, they seem to leave out the counter evidence. Because I certainly did not expect to fall in love with my therapist. And have my first homosexual relationship with a paid prostitute disguised as a therapist. But that's what happened. Now, this opened up a whole can of worms that I didn't know was possible, but there it was. And what I then discovered was that Peter Sandhill, who was a facilitator at the Human Awareness Institute, and it's wonderful, in chauvinistic cults, the symbol is always more important than the substance. So if you name your organization the Human Awareness Institute, that's really important. The name is important. But if you have people in the Institute who are not very aware, well, that's not important because that's feminine, right? That's the inner truth. What's important is to have the right name, the right credentials, the right look, to say the right things. That's important. And so the Human Awareness Institute was presumably interested in human awareness, except when it came to talking about sexual abuse by their leadership. In this area, the Human Awareness Institute was, in fact, the Human Secrecy Institute, but they didn't want to talk about that either. And so as problems began to emerge, which they always do, by the way, anytime a therapist has sex with a client, not to mention the compounding effects of suicide, not to mention the compounding effects of psychedelics, which are generally an amplifier of stuff that's already going on. So if you've got a lot of fucked up stuff going on, often a psychedelic will amplify your awareness of what's going on that's fucked up. And so the Human Awareness Institute decided to sue me. First of all, they decided to try and persuade me not to tell anyone for my benefit, right? This is the Human Awareness Institute. Then they started to block me off of events in my community, which was primarily around, the Institute, because then the secret might get out. And then when I asked them to tell people what had gone on, they said it was not their issue, right? The Human Awareness Institute doesn't have any issues with helping people be aware of the sexual abuse in their leadership bodies. The illegal activities. The Human Awareness Institute, as a 501c3 nonprofit, doesn't have interest in disclosing to people donating money that some of your money may be used to cover up the sexual abuse of its facilitators. And so my life went into a very, very, very dark place, because here I'd hoped to rescue myself from a suicidal destination by paying someone $175 to try a last-ditch effort in psychedelics, and instead I found myself bombarded with a whole wave of emotions around now, by the act of falling in love with a male for the first time. Now I was a homosexual by the fact that I'd fallen in love with a man. But I didn't get any training on how to de-shame myself from all of the fear and panic of a dysfunctional cult that I'd witnessed since birth. And my therapist certainly didn't do anything helpful around this. Never occurred to Peter Sandhill to look at some of the many issues that come up for every man in a homophobic cult who moves in that direction. See, because there's nothing wrong with being affectionate with another human being. But if you have been raised since birth to fear your government, who may put you in prison for homosexual activity, for work with a prostitute. You see, and that's what Peter Sandhill became by charging $175 an hour. He was a prostitute in a therapeutic disguise. By calling this love, he was asking his therapeutic patient to go insane, because it wasn't love, it wasn't kind, it wasn't therapeutic. He asked his client to pay to be abused. Now, it turned out it wasn't just the Human Awareness Institute facilitators who didn't want to engage with this dynamic. When I bypassed the email blockade and wrote to a number of people on team and in my community individually, nobody wanted to help. Nobody wanted to talk about the insanity of going to workshops to learn how to have loving relationships taught by people who sexually abused their therapeutic patients, who didn't have a license to do the work they were doing. None of them wanted to deal with this. And so I became, in a suicidal state, in a confused state, in a state of tremendous betrayal and trauma, isolated from a cult, another cult, a cult within the cult of High, the Human Awareness Institute cult, committed to love and intimacy and healthy sexuality. Within this cult, I was disowned, blockaded for providing awareness that threatened the dogma of the cult. I was disowned from my family for providing human awareness that threatened the dogma of the perfect family. I was disowned by my therapist for providing information that threatened the dogma of their great healing talents. And I was disowned from my community for bringing awareness that threatened the dogma that if only everyone could do high workshops by these wonderful people, the whole world would be different. And the psychedelic community doesn't want to hear about the travesty of whether it's sexual abuse or this, that, the other. They want to live in a pie-in-the-sky world where all the people just need to take psychedelics day and night, smoke marijuana, and then it'll be wonderful. Except most of their lives aren't wonderful. Except, like mine, most of their lives, after 10 years of extensive psychedelic use, are often worse than they were before they began the great journey, right? And in this state of tremendous pain, I had to fight to stay human. Because the amount of betrayal, the amount of ignorance, the amount of cruelty that was pressing down on my psyche was so intense that there was a tremendous pressure to dissociate from my humanity, from my empathic brain, and relate to the world as a reptile, to enter the fight, flight, freeze of the traumatic brain, the reptilian protocol of run from what is bigger than you, fight and kill and consume what is smaller than you, and freeze when neither of those options are available. I began to lose my humanity. The pain was so great that I started to freeze. I started to go numb in my empathy and my humanity. And I watched myself crystallize, become frostbitten psychologically in a cult that lacked the competency to respond. I tried calling my family. Every single one of my family members made it worse. I wrote to every one of the 10 Human Awareness Institute facilitators. Every one of them made it worse. I talked with my clients, because in America, there's this ritual that says, hey, how you doing? How you doing? As if you want to know. So my clients would say, hey, Dane, how you doing? And I'd say, I am in so much pain that I can barely function, and I need help. Great, keep it up. And they'd walk off. This is the American cult. So dumb that I doubt they even realized the stupidity with which they were confronting a systemic cult program that leads to chronic, unnecessary suffering. When you're too blind to know that you're blind, you just repeat because you have nothing else to do. And I had to get out of this cult. Luckily, I'd been to Thailand and the Philippines, and I understood that they were 1,000% more feminine in a number of key ways than America, particularly Thailand. And so I found in Thailand what I could not find in a single American therapist: empathy. Without language, a stranger in Thailand gave me more love, gave me more empathy, cried my tears that as an American shame-based man I couldn't get out of my eyes. She cried my tears for me. And in doing so, she restored my humanity. A peasant. That's the condescending arrogance of a chauvinistic cult. A peasant. Someone in a little mud hut without the sophistications of the American cult, who didn't have an education, gave my humanity back to me. And so did her dog. That is the disgusting level of ignorance and stupidity that every one of us lives in to one degree or another. That someone we look down on through the lenses of materialism, chauvinism, institutionalism, modernism, and capitalism. Why do we look down on her? Because she made $300 a month. Why do people think I'm so great? Because I make $30,000 a month. It's a joke. It's so dumb, we don't even understand that it's dumb. In a little mud hut, without language, with no PhD and no therapist to ruin the whole thing, a woman put her hands on my head, cried my tears, took away my pain, and gave me her dog to love. She gave me what no member of my family, what no member of my cult, what none of my 40 therapists gave me. She gave me humanity. And thank goodness I knew I wouldn't find it in America, and got in a plane before I went totally schizo. Because that's what we do with the hammer, with the tongs, with the whip of the cult and the system. We drive people insane and then have the temerity to punish them for going bonkers simply to survive the cruelty, the unmitigated stupidity of our cult. Now, I was flying home with great trepidation because my visa ran out and because I needed money before returning to Thailand. I stayed as long as I could, but with all of my expenses going on without any income, month after month at home, I needed to go back, and this was a real crisis because I knew that while I could make a ton of money, I'd be in isolation again. My humanity would be in jeopardy. And I was staying in the hotel of my favorite hotel in Thailand, the Chatroom Riverside. It's a 5-star hotel. It's fabulous. But I needed someone to talk to. And I called my fabulous Thai staff, right? They all knew my name. I said, could you get me a monk? I'm so sad. I'm so sick. Now, unfortunately, I'm in the upper echelons of Thai culture, but more importantly, I'm under the auspices of a Swiss manager who's running the hotel in the most important metric for the investors, which is that it makes money. And so he gets wind of this and decides not to get me a monk, not to have any of the staff talk to me, not to come talk to me himself, but to have all my windows bolted in case I throw myself out the window. This is a Western solution to grief and terror and horror. Bolt the windows and leave the chronically abused and traumatized people to go insane in their own loneliness. I told him, I said, this is nuts. One human being, as evidenced by the fact that Dang could do this in a mud hut. With all your fucking degrees and millions of dollars, you don't have one human being capable of sitting with a person in grief that they can't deal with alone because they came from an emotionally illiterate culture that doesn't teach grief any more than it teaches communication, any more than it teaches marital resolution. It doesn't teach anything important. Just how to make money. He was too well educated to grasp the point. A 5-star hotel in my favorite country could not provide what an uneducated woman in a mud hut provided. Thank goodness we're not all educated.